Hear that? That's the sound of silence. And if you're looking to make your PC as quiet as possible, or maybe even silent, then one component you're really going to need to focus your attention on is the graphics card. Well, that is assuming you're a gamer, of course. For the most part, even extreme graphics cards like the Aorus GTX Extreme Edition that I looked at recently run very quiet. Certainly no louder than the rest of the fans in a typical gaming system. Not only that, but once you have your speakers cranked up or your headset on, you aren't exactly going to notice the gentle hum of a high-end gaming PC. However, there are situations where some gamers find even the smallest amount of fan noise a nuisance. I know I personally like to have my gaming PC in the living room generating as little noise as possible. Keeping a modern Intel Core i5 processor, for example, cool, while also making very little noise is pretty easily done. There are countless passive CPU coolers to choose from, like this Thermalright Macho heatsink I have here. But what about the graphics card? Well, there are passive heatsinks you can buy and install on your graphics card as well, such as Arctic's Accelero S3, a universal passive cooler that works with a large number of AMD and Nvidia graphics cards. However, there are some downsides to this approach which you won't face when passively cooling your CPU. For starters, compatibility can be an issue. The Accelero S3, which I used in my example, is not guaranteed to work with AMD and Nvidia graphics cards that don't follow the reference PCB design. So any deviation from this design could render the cooler incompatible. Other drawbacks include the fact that you must install it yourself and therefore risk damaging the graphics card, and will also likely void your warranty in the process. Then there is the issue of the price. At $40 US, this cooler, while impressive, isn't exactly cost effective, especially if you want to pair it with mid-range to entry-level graphics cards. This is where Palit's GTX 1050 Ti KalmX steps in, the first and currently only passively cooled GTX 1050 Ti graphics card on the market. Palit launched their KalmX line with the GTX 750 and 750 Ti, offering silent passively cooled graphics cards based on entry-level GPUs. The 750 Ti was certainly capable enough though when it was released back in early 2014, but today it's not really cutting it. So Palit has upgraded and they are replacing the 60-watt GPU with a much more capable 75-watt TDP model in the GTX 1050 Ti. Now with 20% more CUDA cores that are also more refined and almost 30% more bandwidth, the 1050 Ti offers a serious performance boost. The big question, of course, is how does this thing run without an active fan? Does this nice big passive heatsink allow the GTX 1050 Ti to run at reasonable temperatures and, of course, hit those turbo frequencies without throttling? Well, as you might have expected, that's what we're here to find out in this review, and we will get to the results shortly. But before we do, let's just take a bit more of an in-depth look at this graphics card. Unsurprisingly, Palit has opted for the stock Nvidia clock speeds for the GPU and GDDR5 memory. This means a base clock of 1290 MHz with a boost clock of at least 1392 MHz, and I'll be very interested to see just how high the GPU Boost 3.0 pushes things with this graphics card. The memory is clocked at 1750 MHz for a throughput of 7 gigabits per second. Now, the graphics card itself measures 182mm long and 142mm tall, but it will also take up 2 slots thanks to a 37mm thick heatsink. The PCB, meanwhile, measures just 145mm long and 112mm tall. All up, the card weighs 470 grams, which is surprisingly light given the size of the passively cooled heatsink. In comparison, Gigabyte's own GTX 1050 Ti G1 gaming model is longer at 220mm and quite a bit heavier at 612 grams. Also, unlike the G1 gaming model, this Palit card doesn't require an external 6-pin PCIe power connector, and that's a very good thing in my opinion. The heatsink features a copper base which comes in direct contact with a pair of nickel-plated 6mm heat pipes, which extend out and back into the upper section of the nickel-plated aluminium fin array where they evenly disperse heat from the base. Part of the underside of the heatsink has been flattened out and covered in blue thermal pads which remove heat from the card's VRM. Speaking of the VRM, this Palit card only features a basic 2+1 design which isn't particularly impressive. But then it is only designed to operate at the default Nvidia specification, and overclocking certainly isn't a priority here. As you might have expected, this graphics card does not feature a backplate, and the passive cooler or the passive heatsink doesn't wrap around onto the backside of the graphics card like we have sort of seen in the past. This old Gigabyte model, although the cooler doesn't wrap around onto the backside, you can see that the fins there do protrude onto the backside of the card. And this Asus silencer model features most of the heatsink on the top side, so it can sort of capture airflow from around the CPU section. But yeah, interesting design. Around at the I/O end, we find a basic configuration offering a HDMI 2.0 output, DisplayPort, and DVI output. All three can be used simultaneously for triple monitor workstations. Okay, so enough going over the KalmX, time to do some real testing. Out of the box, the Palit KalmX is just a single frame slower than the Gigabyte G1 gaming model when playing Battlefield 1. My custom overclock, which did push the boost clock up to 1898 MHz, only increased the average frame rate by 6%, which is disappointing given we saw a 13% jump in operating frequency. The Titanfall 2 results are much the same. The stock KalmX card was slightly slower than the Gigabyte G1 gaming, and with the maximum overclock applied it was only slightly faster. Last up I tested with Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, and here the KalmX was good for 47 FPS at 1080p. Overclocking awarded us an extra 3 FPS for another 6% performance boost. Under load, Palit's GTX 1050 Ti KalmX allowed for an entire system consumption figure of 118 watts. That's the exact same figure recorded using the MSI GTX 1050 Ti 4G OC card, and it's 2 watts less than the G1 gaming model. Now for testing temperatures, I decided to stick the KalmX in my Core i3 test rig rather than the extremely well ventilated Core i7 test machine. Our Core i3 system is built inside the Fractal Design Define Nano S, and here the graphics card is pinned hard up against the PSU, so airflow is very minimal. Even so, after an hour-long stress test playing Rise of the Tomb Raider, the GPU temperature only maxed out at 75 degrees. I was quite impressed with that temperature given the test system used, and of course this is a passively cooled graphics card. That said, I should note that it was quite cool on the day I tested, and I had no trouble keeping an ambient room temperature of 21 degrees in the office. For comparison, I took the GTX 1050 Ti KalmX card out of the Nano S and installed it into the Core i7 test rig, which uses the Corsair Crystal Series 570X RGB case. Here it maxed out at 72 degrees, again after an hour of gameplay. Out of the box, the card did hold an operating frequency of just 1683 MHz, and when overclocked it reached 75 degrees at 1898 MHz, though as we saw previously, this only boosted performance by around 6%. Well, there you have it. Palit's passively cooled GeForce GTX 1050 Ti graphics card works. And it works rather well. For those wanting to build a super quiet home theatre PC capable of 1080p gaming, then this KalmX graphics card will fit the bill nicely. The only thing yet to be revealed is the price, though I'm not expecting it to come in at a premium. Palit is generally very competitive on pricing, so I wouldn't be surprised if this passive version doesn't cost much more than a base model card. Of course, when it comes to cost versus performance, the GTX 1050 Ti isn't that impressive to begin with, and many will just opt for an RX 470 instead. However, you cannot buy a passively cooled RX 470, and I don't expect that to change as this is a 120 watt TDP GPU. This then does make the Palit GTX 1050 Ti KalmX very unique, and as I said previously, a must-have item for those wanting to build a very quiet PC. Let me know what you guys think about this graphics card in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the review, maybe consider giving it a like. Anyway, I'm your host Steve. See you next time.